Before we begin, I want to show you that picture. I received this early this morning. I got up and looked at my phone, and this message had come to me from Malawi. So that's Ed Cruikshank up there preaching this morning. There's about, I think he said 136 in attendance. He's preaching in a place that had a very colorful name, Area 36. I don't know I guess how they divide their places up, but he's in Area 36. I don't know where that is. I tell you, I'll have to admit, I know where Africa is. I'm not real sure where Malawi is. I'd have to get my map out and find where Malawi is. It's one of those inward countries on inside. I don't think it's on the coast, is it? It's a landlocked country there. So 136 in attendance. Those are our brethren. They are gathered together. They heard Ed preach. They took the Lord's Supper like we're going to do. The morning came to them before it came to us. And then this old world will keep turning, and it'll go on around to the islands later out over the Pacific, and they'll probably rising about this hour, and some of them will be gathered together later this day and take the Lord's Supper as well. Isn't that interesting? All around the world, over the time, the hours pass, and people are rising, worshiping the Lord, returning to their homes, and they've already done that in Malawi. He said there were 7 responses to the sermon this morning. He said confessions, so I suppose that's a confession of sin, wanting to be restored, something like that. So good for him. So as we get reports, I'll bring that up and try to keep us in tune with Ed and Lena as they're working. Let's turn to the book of Mark. Mark chapter 8, verses 22 through 26. I hope the PowerPoint this morning helps us. I feel like it's an aid in my teaching, but I'm going to be a little out of order. I got up and said, I want to say this first, and it shows up later in the PowerPoints. I'll correct that as we go. Maybe it'll just keep you paying attention, wonder where he's going next. But I see men like trees walking. Well, that's when Jesus heals this blind man in Bethsaida. The accounts of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are filled with stories of his miracles. And these miracles are told without apology. It would just as soon tell you about a miracle he did as it would to tell you how he got in a ship and talked to the people. And we can see how maybe he'd get in a little boat, talk to people on the shore, but then he just tells a miracle, just the same matter of fact. No apologies for telling those miracles. And I'll tell you, when we talk about Christ today, we make no apologies for those miracles either. We believe them. In fact, it would be hard to believe in Jesus without those miracles. And in the very nature of those miracles, it's not that he went out and just did a bunch of magic tricks and impressed people. They're absolutely astounding miracles, and so many times, like in this instance, he does them with such modesty. That's just impressive, isn't it? These stories are told in such a manner that they're told like they're real. And when you read them, they sound real. They don't sound like fables or tales or magic stories or make-believe. They sound real, don't they? And we would expect that. If Jesus is God in the flesh, he'd have the power to do miracles. In the slide I'm going to show a little later that it'll be a little out of place, but the prophets had said he'd do these miracles. And so here he is. We would expect it. And so we're going to talk about one of those miracles of Christ. Kind of a strange miracle that he does here. And then the amazing thing about this miracle is not focusing in on the miracle itself, but I want to take us back to what happened before. And then we're going to look and see a little bit of what's going to happen afterward. And we'll see how this fits into Mark's narrative here about Jesus by looking at this miracle. I see men like trees walking. Let me read the miracle to you. Acts 8:22 through 28. And he cometh to Bethsaida. We'll talk about that in just a minute. He cometh to Bethsaida, and they bring a blind man to him, and he besought him to touch him. By the way, when we were singing our song, remember we were singing about how he made the blind to see just a moment ago. And therefore we're begging him to cleanse us. We sing about those miracles, don't we? Here's one where he makes the blind to see. They besought him to touch him. Now notice the touch. We'll get back to that. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the town. Well, that sounds real, doesn't it? Blind man, he doesn't know. He may have a stick. He didn't have a seeing-eye dog back then, but he took him by the hand and said, "Well, follow." So you had to lead the blind man by the hand, took him out of the town, and when he'd spit on his eyes, the spittle there, look at this. He had spit on his eyes and put his hands upon him. He asked him if he saw aught, and he looked up and said, "I see men as trees walking." Well, after that, he put his hands upon his eyes and made him look up, and he was restored and saw every man clearly. And he sent him away to his house, saying, "Neither go into the town, nor tell it to any in the town." There's some strange things about this miracle that make it unique. In fact, I'm going to show you this is one of two miracles that are only recorded in the book of Mark. Well, I'm getting ahead of myself again, but most of these miracles, we have collaborative testimony from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Some of them tell about different ones, but only Mark tells about this one. We'll see why maybe in a little bit. He cometh to Bethsaida. Beth, when you see the word Beth, it means the house, okay? The house. And so these words have meanings. Bethsaida, it's the house of, and then there are two words. It's either the house of hunting or the house of fishing. And it'd be the house of hunting, but this is talking because of the kind of village Bethsaida was, they must have been hunting fish. So it'd be the house of fishing. It's one of those many little villages around the Sea of Galilee, a little fishing village there. Now here it is on the map. You see the Jordan River coming in from the north? They're going toward the Sea of Galilee. And Bethsaida near where the Jordan River joins the Sea of Galilee. And the commentators that I studied on this said that was a place that was rich in fish, with that fresh water coming into this sea. And so that was a very good, you can usually get good fishing there along that river. Remember, they weren't fishing with rods and reels now. They'd gather them in with their nets. And this was one of the fishing villages. It's not too far from Capernaum. Do you see the little dotted line on that map going north out of Bethsaida? That's the road going to Caesarea Philippi. And Jesus is on his way there, and that'll come up in the story here in just a minute. So that's where the story takes place. Well, he comes out and he heals the man, but this is the only miracle that wasn't immediately in its results. There were two stages to this. And when he put his hands on the blind man's eyes, he put spit on them and then put his hands on them. And he said, "What do you see?" And he said, "I see men like trees walking." Well, that almost sounds funny to me. We can smile at that. Can you imagine the surprise of what if you hadn't been able to see? And then all of a sudden you can see, how would you describe what you saw? And that just sounds so real, doesn't it? That might be something you would expect someone to see. That it's going to say he restored his sight. Now that makes it sound like he had been able to see in the past, and now his sight is restored. You'll see that on the next slide. So the fact that he didn't really know how to describe very clearly what it was he was seeing makes it sound like he had been very blind. You know, you can be legally blind and still be able to read sometime if you can hold things just right and all, and you have some vision. Sounds like he had no vision, and he had been blind for a long time. I've been reading about the area over there. I read something that just seems, it's so distant from us that we would think this, but they had a problem around the Sea of Galilee with flies. And they would come to the eyes, and they are always, and mothers would be so tired of brushing the eyes away from their children's eyes that they just let them cover their eyes. And well, that's the reason there was so much blindness over there. They would become infected from these flies coming in and lighting on their eyes, and others just let them have it. And then for a lot, and they didn't understand about disease and germs, and they never associated those flies with the blindness. But that's what I'm reading there. This man may have been able to see as a young child, and now his sight is restored. It sounds like he'd been blind for a long time, and very blind, so that it was hard to express just what he had seen. Well, and then he put his hands on his eyes, and he looked up, and he was restored. See, there's the restored. He saw clearly. Well, now that wasn't an immediate miracle, but it wasn't like he says, okay, now, you know, I go to the doctor sometime and he'll give me something and say, you know, after a year or two, this will be better off. Well, that's not the way Jesus did it. He said, no, it was total healing, but he did it in 2 stages. There may be a parable there. And that's where we're going to get into the context as to why 2 stages here instead of just in 1 stage. But he put his hands on his eyes, made him look up. He was restored. He saw every man clearly. And he sent him away to his house, saying, neither go into the town nor tell it to any in town. So many times Jesus would, these amazing miracles, he said, now don't tell. The word will get out. Sometimes they just ignored him and went and told it anyway. But Jesus was not out here to be putting on sideshows or raise just an emotional furor. He had serious building blocks to lay, and these miracles were part of the evidence of that. But what he is doing is bigger than any miracle. But on this instance, he's trying to get out of town. He's on his way to Caesarea Philippi. So he says, now don't go down and tell everybody. It would delay long enough for him to go ahead and leave and head out toward Caesarea Philippi without being stopped by others that were attracted to him, maybe would delay him because of this miracle that was done. That may be why he's telling him that now. Okay, that was the verse I was talking about. Isaiah 35 in verse 5. That's what the prophet said he would do. Then the eyes of the blind shall be opened, and the ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. Look at the evidence. The way the story's told. The modesty of that miracle. The benevolent nature of it. And it's just told without apology, but there's a man doing miracles. That's exactly what the prophet said the Messiah would do. You see the strong foundation that lays for our faith in these stories about Christ? Now, 2 miracles that Mark tells that's not told by Matthew or Luke or John. If it wasn't for Mark, we wouldn't know these. And I think it's kind of interesting how it comes out in English. I don't know the Greek, but you've got the D word now, the deaf man of Decapolis, and then you've got the B word, the blind man of Bethsaida. Maybe that's the way we can remember them. The deaf man of Decapolis and the blind man of Bethsaida. Let me read to you that story about that deaf man again. Been a few weeks since we did this, and just a short story. And again, departing from the coast of Tyre and Sidon, he came to the Sea of Galilee through the midst of the coast of Decapolis. And they bring to him one that was deaf and had an impediment in his speech. And they beseech him to put his hands on them, wanting him to touch him again. He took him aside from the multitude. He did that again. He put his fingers into his ears and spit. Well, there's the spittle again. And touched his tongue, and looking up to heaven, he sighed and said, Ephphatha, that is, be opened. And straightway his ears were open, and the string of his tongue was loosed, and he spake plain, and he charged them that they should tell no man. But the more he charged them, so much more a great deal they published it, and were beyond measure astonished, saying, He hath done all things well. He maketh both the deaf to hear and the dumb to speak. Let's compare those two miracles. They're both unique to Mark. I'm going to show you the comparison and then something that happened in between them. Here it is. One, it's the first account of Mark restoring hearing to the deaf. And the second one is the first account of Mark of healing, restoring sight to the blind, giving the blind man sight. There's going to be another account when Jesus goes through Jericho. In fact, these two accounts kind of bracket his journey from Galilee to Jericho. This account, he's going to go to Caesarea Philippi, down to Jericho, that account, and then he's going to go up to Jerusalem. But two different healings of the blind, but these are the first. Number two, the deaf man and the blind man were brought to Jesus by others. It's good to have good friends, isn't it? If you got a friend that can bring you to Jesus, you have a good friend. And maybe you can be that friend and bring someone with spiritual deafness or spiritual blindness. Bring them to Jesus. Number three, both those who brought the deaf man to Jesus and who brought the blind man to Jesus requested that Jesus touch them, that they may be healed. They had the same request. Touch the deaf man so he can hear. Touch the blind man so he can see. Jesus didn't have to touch. No, he could just speak the word. But often he would touch. And the touch would bring the contact, and it would be obvious then that this came from Jesus. He didn't have to touch him to heal him, but it would show others that, yes, Jesus is definitely the one doing this healing when he touched him. Number four, in both instances, Jesus took the man aside to heal them in a private setting. He didn't make a circus out of this. He didn't say, okay, everybody, come around. Look at this great thing I'm about to do. And everybody applaud and clap. And that's not what Jesus did. He did this very modestly. These amazing miracles done with such modesty. All right, number five. In both acts of healing, Jesus used touch and spittle. Mark talks about the spittle. I read from the commentaries. Now, that's the authority on this, so you can take it for what it's worth there. But that spittle was often associated with healing. And so the fact that he's using spittle was a sign then for others seeing this, that there's a healing going on here that Jesus is doing. But he did touch them both times. He was requested to touch them, and he did. And both times we read something about the spittle here. It's verse 6. In both instances, once the healing process was completed, the healing itself was complete, and the function of that which was healed was fully restored. The man didn't have trouble hearing after he restored his eyes. The string of his tongue was loosed. He could speak plainly. And now this man could see clearly. Number 7, in both instances, Jesus charged those who had been healed to refrain from telling others what had been done. Why, the deaf man didn't do it. Everybody went around telling about that anyway. The more he said not to, the more they told it. And the second time, it may have been, give me time, get out of town. Don't go to town, and don't tell it in town. I'm going to leave. And maybe after that he could tell it. But Jesus wanted to get out of town before the crowds would gather and hinder him on his way. That may have been why he told the the blind man, not to go back to town and tell it. But then number 8, Jesus opened the ears of the deaf man after his return to the regions about Galilee from the borders of Tyre and Sidon. So he's coming into Galilee, and he does this miracle. Now he's on his way out of Galilee, going towards Caesarea Philippi, and he does another one on the way out. There's similarities in those two miracles, aren't there? Let's look what happened in between. It's a little longer reading, but there's something here I want you to catch between these two stories that kind of tie them together. In those days, the multitude being very great and having nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to them and said, I have compassion on the multitude, because they've now been with me 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them away fasting in their own houses, they'll faint by the way. For divers of them came from far, and his disciples answered him, From whence can a man satisfy these men with bread here in the wilderness? He said, How many loaves have ye? They said, 7. He commanded the people to sit down on the ground. He took the 7 loaves and gave thanks and brake and gave to the disciples and set before them. And they did eat that which was set before the people. And they had a few small fishes, and he blessed them and commanded to set them also before him. And they did eat and were filled. And they took up of the broken meat that was left 7 baskets. And they that had eaten were about 4,000. And he sent them away. And straightway he entered into a ship with the disciples and came to the parts of Dalmanutha. And the Pharisees came forth and began to question him, seeking a sign from heaven from him, tempting him. Didn't they just feed 4,000? Show us a sign. They weren't interested in a sign. Jesus was upset with them. He sighed deeply in his spirit and said, Why does this generation seek after a sign? Verily I say unto you, there shall no sign be given to this generation. And he left them and entered into a ship and departed for the other side. Now the disciples had forgotten to take bread, neither had they in the ship with them more than 1 loaf. And he charged them, saying, Take heed beware the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. And they reasoned among themselves, That's because we have no bread. And Jesus knew it. He said unto them, Why reason ye because ye have no bread? Perceive ye not yet, neither understand? Have ye yet hardened your heart? Now here it is. Look at verse 18. Having eyes, see ye not, and having ears, hear ye not. He's not talking about their physical sight, their physical hearing. My disciple, aren't you paying attention? Don't you remember when I break the 5 loaves among 5,000, how many baskets full you took up? Is it 12? And then among the 7, among 4,000, how many baskets full did you take up? I said 7. He said, How is it you do not understand? Aren't you paying attention? Don't you see? Can't you hear? When Jesus spake of the leaven of the Pharisees and of Herod, he was talking in terms like a parable. He's talking spiritual. They're thinking only physical without spiritual understanding. Can't you see and can't you hear? He had just caused the deaf man to hear, and now he causes the blind man to see. That's what happens between these. It's kind of like he's teaching them not just that he is the Christ, but he's wanting them to learn something else by these miracles. And so he took the blind man, and notice how he said, First, I see men as trees walking. And then he saw every man clearly. That was like the disciples. I'll tell you what's going to happen next. I'll get into it next month. Jesus is going to go to Caesarea Philippi. Whom do men say that I, the Son of Man, am? And they said, Peter's going to confess. And when he said, Whom say ye that I am? Peter's going to confess, Thou art the Christ. And before the chapter's over, he's going to rebuke Peter and say, "Get thee behind me, Satan. Thou savorest not the things of God, but the things that be of man." What was Peter's problem? Peter could see that Jesus was the Christ, but he didn't see clearly. Maybe that's why the story is told just before this event. And now Jesus is going to start speaking to them plainly. Here's what it means to be the Christ. I'll tell you. It means I'm going to die on a cross. That's what Peter couldn't see. I don't see how that could be. And they're going to see clearly the Christ after he rises from the dead. But it's going to be a while. I tell you, that's like us, isn't it? It's like us. We see, but do we see clearly? We understand some things about Jesus, and maybe we think we know him. Do we know him yet? Do we see him clearly? Or do we see him as the blind man saw men like trees walking? We don't have a clear image, and we don't really know how to express ourselves clearly. But the longer we spend with Jesus, the more we study his word, the more we meditate on these things, the clearer the picture will be. And we'll see more clearly. Someday we'll see him in all his glory. Oh, what a sight that will be. And we'll see clearly. So these miracles that Mark told, these two, they're kind of like a little parable involved in that miracle. There's a spiritual lesson to learn from those miracles. Let's open our eyes. Let's open our ears. And what faulty vision we have now will clear up as we continue in these studies. But do you see enough yet? Do you see enough yet to know that I want to follow Jesus? If you see that much now, then you see clear enough to know that I need to be baptized in the Christ. We're going to give you an opportunity, that invitation this morning. You're ready to take that step. Then as we stand and say,